then the average amount that the firm will produce is 100 units every day. That's the sort of way I want to think about interpreting these curves. I don't know if anyone's ever thought about what these curves mean in that sense, right? Because, I mean, obviously, like, producing this much, I mean, that doesn't mean anything, right? It has to be over this period of time on average, you know, something like that, right? Yeah, go ahead.
The way I've always thought about it
Yeah.
is, like, if the market were in equilibrium, how much would the firm like to produce? Like, only that very hypothetically equilibrium.
Well, I mean, so I'm not sure I know exactly what's meant by equilibrium, but I want to have some notion that has some correspondence with something that we could actually observe in the world. Like, I want to have a supply function that has a meaning that I could actually observe in data, because otherwise the model's not very useful, right? So I think what we mean is that we take some given time period and we ask what is the average production you would have over that period if the price were on average something. That's a definition that has some meaning to me, right? I mean, there's other definitions you could give, but I don't know what equilibrium means, right? Because even if it is an equilibrium, over what time period is it an equilibrium? I mean, what does that actually mean? You know, I don't know. So I'm going to say that the quantity is the average quantity produced over some duration per some unit time. And price is something that, of course, prices move around during the relevant period, right? So what does it mean if the average price is this? It also depends on how much the price moves around. What we're going to think about is holding fixed sort of the way in which the price moves around. And we're going to think of the prices that, when we move along the curves, as changes in the average price leaving sort of the temporal pattern of the price fixed. So some like constant upward shift in the pattern of prices. And the quantities also could move around. But again, I want to know some sort of like average change in the quantities over that period. That's sort of how we're going to think about these models, as being summaries of those things. And once you think about it that way, you realize the standard static supply and demand framework, which is a pretty powerful and interesting framework, is actually looking at one pretty narrow slice of a bigger picture. But I think it's an important narrow slice to think about nonetheless. So, and all of this is going to hold fixed anything that's not under the control of the firm, such as future prices and so forth. So I think it then becomes very clear that at least one of the many things that supply depends on is what's the relevant duration of production that we're considering. Are we saying the supply over the course of the next month, or the supply over the course of the next 10 years, right? Because how much a change in the average price over that period will impact the average quantity over that period is going to depend a lot on how long the period that we are considering is. And that is how I want to interpret runs. So when someone says short run, long run, I want to interpret it very literally. It means if this is the supply over a short run of production, I don't know if people know the word run in that sense in English. A run is like how long you're doing something, right? It's like this is a quick run of production or a long run of production. That's exactly how I'm going to interpret it, as the duration of production and the duration of the change in price. And so we can then interpret the curves as the reaction that we would expect the firms to have to changes in price or demand over some duration of time. And so each curve will correspond to a different duration of time over which things might occur. The longer the duration or the run of production, the more you're going to be able to adjust things which take a long time to adjust, right? I think that's a little bit what, was it was Juan you were talking about? Yeah, you mentioned that, you know, if it takes a longer time, then if you have a longer time, then you can adjust more things. And I'll go through lots of examples of that. And thus, we can usually identify different run curves with different things that might be adjustable during those times. So for example, people think that in the short run, you can usually adjust things like how many unskilled laborers you're hiring, how much raw materials you're buying. Those are things that over the course of a month or two, you can probably make adjustments to. In the medium term, you might be able to adjust the size of your factory or the way that you're producing in the factory. And it might take longer time for companies to actually come into the industry or to adjust the things which are the inputs to your inputs. So for example, if there's a short-run increase in the demand for cars, the car company might be able to buy more steel, right? But it might, and then in the longer run, they might be able to build more steel factories. But in order to have the people who produce the iron or the coal that goes into making that steel build new factories or hire new workers, that might take much longer, right? So sort of the further you get away, the less something is exposed to this particular area, the longer time it's going to take to adjust those factors of production. Now, of course, all these particular examples I gave are sort of heuristics or loose ways of doing things. It will depend on the particular example how long it takes to adjust things. One example of that is, I don't know if anyone knows Groupon, right? You probably have Groupon here, but you probably also have 17 other companies doing exactly what Groupon does. When was Groupon created? Maybe 2 or 3 years ago? Already there's like 1,000 companies that are in the same market. So the notion that it takes a long time for firms to enter a market obviously depends on what type of market it is. If it's producing steel, maybe it takes a long time. Even a restaurant might take a while. To do the same thing Groupon does takes a couple weeks of getting your programming together, right? Because it's an area where, programming and getting computer space, that's something that moves very quickly, right? On the other hand, the medical industry is basically using the same technology to give diagnosis that it was using 150 years ago, as we talked about, right? So there's somewhere where, because of lots of political impediments, even changing the processes of production, rather than having companies come into the industry, takes forever, because you have to change the whole political infrastructure that's associated with it, right? So what takes how long to change depends a lot on the details of the industry. The institutional and legal context are crucial. And so when we talk about short run versus long run, I think we can very sloppily get into the thing of saying, this is the short run, this is the medium run, this is the long run. We've really got to say is like, if the run of production is 5 years, what do we think is realistic to adjust over that time, right? If it's 7 years, what's realistic over that time? We should really be specific about the time periods we're talking about, not just vaguely gesture at the long run and the short run, because that can lead to very sloppy and sort of irrelevant thinking. Because people can just say, oh, well, in the long run, blah will happen. Well, if the long run means 300 years, maybe we really are all dead. If the long run means 5 years, then maybe we aren't all dead at that point, right? I don't know if people know this famous Keynes quote, which said that in the long run, we're all dead, right? Okay, so what is the classic relationship among these curves when we allow people to adjust more things? Well, the typical relationship is that the long run and short run marginal cost curves, and therefore supply functions, cross at the same point when we're at the initial equilibrium, right? When everything is where it should be adjusted to for the long run, then in the short run, if we're currently at that level, the cost has to be the same. But if we now move away from that equilibrium, it's going to be easier to adjust more things in the long run than in the short run. And what that means is that the long run marginal cost is not as steep as the short run marginal cost is. That is, it doesn't take as much to expand beyond, but we also can't lower our costs that much by reducing below that level, right? And therefore, the supply function, which is given by the marginal cost curve, is going to be more elastic in the long run than it is in the short run, because there's more things we can adjust, and therefore we can react more. And the short run curve will be more inelastic. The short run average cost curve will just touch the long run average cost curve at the point where you're at the long run optimum. Why is that? because you chose your particular setting of the long run things that you can adjust in the short run so as to be most productive for the short run that you expected to experience, right? In equilibrium. But if you end up producing more or less than you expected, you would have been able to adjust your fixed factors in order to get a lower cost, right? And therefore, the long run average cost curve is going to lie below that short run average cost curve. The short run will sort of come up more steeply above and below the long run. So another way of showing that is this. So here you have a bunch of different short run cost curves, and each one of them at their minimum just touches the long run cost. This is what's called the envelope theorem. It says that if you've chosen things to be the best that they can possibly be for the short run that you expect, then there will be an exact equality between the short run and the long run curves at that point. But if you start moving beyond it, this short run curve will now be more expensive and the long run will be cheaper. So the long run curve is really just the envelope of all of these short run curves at the point at which you would choose the fixed factors to be what would be optimal for this particular short run situation. This is a very deep principle in economics. What it says is that if we're optimizing two things, the effect of an increase in one of the things is at the optimal choice of the other one exactly what it would be if you could adjust both of the things at the same time. Because you've chosen the other thing to be the most efficient that it can possibly be at that point, and therefore you wouldn't gain any reduction in your cost by adjusting the other thing, because it's already been chosen optimal. Okay. Now, what I've been assuming so far is that you can always adjust more things in the long run over long periods of time with long durations than you can in short durations for short periods of time. And Francisco Ortega, is Francisco here? Francisco Ortega? No. Okay, so why is it usually assumed that you can choose more things in the long run than you can in the short run? Well, the idea is that it can be very costly to change things quickly. That's the intuitive idea, right? Now, that's certainly true for some things, but it's definitely not true for everything. So the key distinction is whether the relevant goods are intertemporal complements or intertemporal substitutes. We'll also call intertemporal complements durables. And Nancy, what is it that defines a durable? Give me a sense for what an intertemporal complement or durable is. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Your house will last a certain amount of time, but you can use it as much as you want during that time. Yeah, go ahead. Well, the idea is that if I get educated, right, basically for the rest of my relatively short life, I can use my education however I want. There's no real cost to me of using my education, right? And so another way of saying that is that it's much cheaper to be educated today and educated tomorrow than it is to be educated today and uneducated tomorrow. It's almost impossible to be educated today and uneducated. You could probably pull it off, but it's hard, right? Maybe you guys could try that with this class. See if you can unlearn everything that I taught you tomorrow. So these things last for a fixed period of time, and they depreciate over time. So if you get educated today, in 20 years you'll be less educated. You'll have forgotten some of the things. But it's not actually using your education that causes it to depreciate. In fact, it's probably actually causes you to keep your education if you use it more often, right? So it doesn't make sense to change your level of education very often. It doesn't make sense to change how many factories you have very often. Once you have a factory, you can use it a lot without paying much additional cost, right? So it's cheap to use during the limited lifespan for which it lasts. Where you live is a classic example of that, right? Once you already live in one place, right, it's very costly to live in one place today and live somewhere else tomorrow, right? And it's not very, costly to enjoy living in that place very often during the time that you live there. And on the other hand, you can think about things that are intertemporal substitutes, or you could also call them storable or exhaustible. And again, Eugenio is not here, right? No. These are things which last basically forever, but you can only use them a certain number of times. So it's using them that depreciates them, not having them. And that makes it very cheap to change them in the short term, but very expensive to change them in the long term. And I'll give more examples of this in a moment. So they're expensive to use during their long lifetime. So this is exactly the opposite of intertemporal complements. So vacations are a classic example of this, right? So you think about a vacation. You're only going to take a certain number of vacations during your life, right? You're not going to be like constantly taking vacations, right? But each time you take a vacation, therefore, you're sort of like removing one more from the number of vacations you have during your whole life. It's very cheap for you to say, look, I'm not going to take a vacation this week, I'll take a vacation next week. You hardly care. But you definitely need to take some vacation during your lifetime or during, maybe a year, right? Because otherwise you're going to go crazy. So these are things that you can substitute across time. They're things where if you took a vacation this week, you don't want to take a vacation next week. It's the opposite of an education. If you have an education this week, you're going to have an education next week for sure. Whereas if you take a vacation this week, you don't want to take a vacation next week, right? That's an intertemporal substitute. Now, all of this depends on context, but let me go through some examples of what are usually classified as very durable, very much intertemporal complements, what things are very storable, very much intertemporal substitutes. So entry by firms into an industry or a country is usually thought to be very durable. It's thought to take a long time to do it and to last for a long while. Culture is thought to be something which is very durable. So the most prominent example of this is that there's this famous hypothesis that called the Boserup hypothesis, that the reason why in some countries women work a lot, I think Colombia is actually a country, from what I've noticed, where that's true, and other countries where people don't work a lot, has to do with very, very, very ancient things. Back 4,000 years, whether the cultures that originally were in that place used the hoe or used the plow. So the plow is a big, heavy thing that men need to carry, right? And the hoe is some little thing that women can use very easily. And apparently you can explain about 25% of the variation in people's women's labor force participation in countries if 4,000 years ago in that place people were using the hoe versus using the plow. So culture is thought to be something that endures for a very long time. Political, economic, and social institutions. There's been a lot of work by James Robinson, I don't know if any of you guys have attended his classes, about how long social and economic institutions last. Now, less durable things are machines, job experience, that's something you tend to forget pretty quickly. Physical plants last a while, but they can be renewed more quickly than culture can, for example. Production procedures is another thing like that. Personal relationships last a while, but again, they decay more quickly maybe than culture or religion does. Memory. Variable things are things that are in between. They're things that you use on sort of a minute-to-minute basis, and they neither substitute across time nor are complementary across time. So unskilled labor, bulky raw materials, advertising. I think a lot of people think, you see an advertisement, it doesn't stay with you for long. Maybe you get a little bit of the good in the meantime, but it doesn't last that long. Rent, anything that you can rent and return is something that's variable because you don't need to keep it for a long time. Somewhat storable things are inventories of goods, right? So often a company will like order a bunch of stuff and they will use some of it, and if they use it now, then they don't have it to use later, right? Another example of this might be a consumer good which is discontinued but you have a store of. So imagine there's like a favorite candy that you have and it's now gone out of production, right? Now you have some of it at home. You don't want to use too much of it today because you won't have it to eat tomorrow, right? But on the other hand, you can't store it for an infinite amount of time because at some point it will go away, right? It will deteriorate. So those are examples of things that are more storable, that you substitute for across time. Various storable things are exhaustible resources like oil, gas, or copper. There's just a certain amount of it there. You're going to use it up, and at some point that's it, right? So there's only so much of it that we can ever do. Now that's not perfectly true because you can dig for more coal or gas, but pretty much there's just a certain amount there, right? And money for individuals is that way, right? You have a certain amount of money. If I use money today, I can't use it tomorrow. It's an intertemporal substitute. Great bottles of wine might be another example of that, right? You can keep them for very long. In fact, they get better the longer you keep them. But once you use them, you can never use them again. Okay, so why does all of this matter? Well, the more things you can adjust, the more you're able to react, right? So I said that things are more elastic in the long run than they are in the short run. Why? Because you're able to adjust more things in the long run than the short run. But that's totally the opposite if you have things that are intertemporal substitutes, and I'll go through that in a minute. So independent of whether the factor is a complement or substitute, you're able to adjust more the more you're able to react, the more you can adjust things over that time period. So if the price of gasoline rises for a long period, the demand usually falls by more. And the reason is that over a long period of time, you can adjust more things than you can in a short period. So in a short period of time, you can adjust how much you travel, right? So there will be some reduction if gas rises temporarily, because people will put off their vacations till later, right? Or until the price of gas falls. But in a longer period of time, they can buy a cleaner car, right? And the interesting thing is that the response to the change in the price of gas might not be more elastic for the longest period, for a middle period of time as it is for either the short period of time or the very long period of time. Because in the very long period of time, you can change what cars you have, you can change what sort of electricity you use, all that sort of stuff. In the very short period of time, you can change whether you take a vacation or not. But in the medium period of time, you can't change either of these things, right? Because you're going to have to take a vacation sometime this year. So if the price of gas rises for the whole year, you won't change when you take your vacation. But you also won't be able to change what type of car you have. So over different periods of times, whether things adjust more or less in the short run or the long run depends on what things are intertemporal complements and substitutes over what periods, right? So supply is always more elastic over the time frames when more things adjust. And the key is how things adjust relative to the market opportunities. So if you have some durable good, but you can sell it, you're only renting it, or you can sell it back very cheaply, it's not really durable for you, right? You can easily buy it now and then sell it back later. You can buy the clean car and then sell it back later. If it's storable, but you can offload it at a market price, like if you had that candy, but you were easily able to buy it at the same price from someone else or sell it back, then it's not really storable for you, right? Because you can eat it now and then sell it back or buy more later if you need it, right? So the key thing is how many things are storable or durable relative to the markets that exist for those products. Okay, so let's focus now on the case of durables, which is the traditional case that people consider in economics. But be aware that there's this opposite case of storables that's also really important. Okay, so taking time seriously and really trying to think about the relationships between durability, storability, and all these things raises some questions about what we mean by these various curves. So one thing is, what's the relationship between the length of the duration of supply and the relevant run to consider, the short run, the long run? What types of shifts in demand are we thinking about? What will be the difference between, say, a short-run reaction to a long-term shift and the long-term reaction to the long-term shift? That is, what will happen immediately and what will happen eventually? What is the long-term effect of having many short-run shifts over some period, right? So we want to say, what is the long-run effect of the fact that we now learn that rather than everything being constant, it will be moving around all the time? What if it's unclear initially whether a long-run shift is going to last forever, or if it's only going to be last for a short time? What does the actual path of adjustments look like? Now, the way that people have been looking at this most recently is by writing down dynamic models. And I don't know if any of you guys have had experience with dynamic models. They tend to get very, very complicated and often quite confusing. And so what I'm going to try to do today is to take a different approach, which was taken by Alfred Marshall, which is to try to think about these dynamic things, these types of questions I just asked, without using a dynamic model. Just using these types of static analysis we've been doing now to think about how we could answer these types of questions. OK. And we'll try to reflect on the role of time, but more informally. And hopefully, this will equip us to handle these types of issues in a way that's easy, but also careful. And the key principle is going to be that all the static models we talk about are averages of things that are going on in this more dynamic world we live in. Now, Alfred Marshall's justification for this, I don't think I have it here. There's a very beautiful quote by him that you can look up in a recent paper by Peter Diamond, where he says that time is one of the many issues in economics where, because of the limited power of the human mind, we can't look at everything that goes on at the same time. We have to zoom in on one issue very specifically and get a very clear understanding of that. And then zoom out and say, OK, how does that fit into the broader picture? What other issues might I want to get a better understanding of? Zoom in on those and get a clearer understanding of them, and then zoom out again and look at the big picture, right? And in that process, every time, everything that's specific, we get a broader understanding of, and everything that's general becomes more precise. So that's sort of the analytic method that we're going to try to take. OK, let's talk about different types of shifts that could occur in demand, and then try to think about the effects of them. So you could have a one-time shift which permanently changes things. So for example, the demand for paper has almost certainly permanently gone down because of the introduction of the iPad, right? You can have one-time shifts that only last for a short period of time. So for example, in many cities in the United States, it's become very popular to have cupcakes. Now, I don't think that that's going to last for very long. I mean, they're fine, but they're no better than cookies. I think there's going to be this uptick in the demand for cupcakes, and it'll go back down again, right, in a few years. You can have a secular trend, which is that things are sort of gradually going in one direction. So the demand for medical care is probably something like that. Because as people get wealthier, they care more about living longer relative to just having more things to play with during their life. There's other things that move in a predictable cycle. So the seasonal demand for vacations and for electricity every year goes in some cyclical pattern. And what that means is that if there are many durable factors, production is going to be less efficient, right? Think about it. Think about vacations. There's all these like hotels that have to be built. And vacations are very expensive because if everyone was all the year round using the hotel, they could defray their fixed costs by charging a little bit to everyone during each period. But because there's this cyclical demand for these vacations are very expensive. So if you have sectors where there's these cyclic demands, but there's these lots of durables, things are going to be more expensive on average than they're going to be otherwise, right? So that's one example of how you can use this static reasoning to make these dynamic predictions about the levels of things that will happen, right? Things can also move in an unpredictable cycle. So one example of this is that apparently men buy many, many fewer underwear when the economy is bad, and much more underwear when the economy is good. And so that's an unpredictable cycle because you can't really predict the business cycle, but you can predict that things are going to fluctuate, right? Things can also move in just completely crazy ways. So fashion items are like this. It's like almost impossible to tell what will be up, what will be down, whether it will go back to the old trend, whether, you know, they could go in all sorts of ways. The demand for gold and for diamonds is like that as well. Okay, so previously, we were treating different factors as exogenously being stuck into the bucket of being fixed or variable. Variables you could adjust in the short run, fixed you couldn't adjust. But the real key to determining what thing belongs where is it's the durability of the factor, how long it takes to adjust it, relative to the length of time of the run that we're considering, right? So if the durability is long and the run is short, then it's not going to be adjustable. If the durability is short and the run is long, then it will be considered a variable factor. So let's try to think through some examples of this. So Anna, what do you think? If the run is 5 years long and the factor is whether you own an iPad or not, so like, you know, imagine that the 5 years are you're going to graduate school and the question is, should you get an iPad? Do you think that you should consider an iPad to be a fixed or a variable factor? Yeah, exactly. iPads only last a couple of years anyways, right? So if you know, suddenly there's something that demands that you have more access to electronic resources, you're almost certainly going to buy an iPad in response to that, if you're ever going to buy it, right? It's not like you were saying, well, it's not worth it for these 5 years to have the iPad, right? Because that's something that's only going to last a couple of years anyways, right? How about if you have a 2-year run and the thing is building a whole corporate campus? Imagine that there's like a demand that's only going to last for 2 years, and the question is, should you build a new campus for a corporation, right? Oscar's not here, right? Yeah. Oscar Solis. Oscar Solis. Oh, no, he's not. Okay. That's extremely fixed. I mean, it'd be crazy if there's a demand that's only going to last for 2 years to build a whole corporate campus, right? That takes so much work, something that's going to last for years and years. What are you going to do with it afterwards? You're going to have to repurpose it. So that's going to be a very fixed factor. Now, here's a tougher case. What if there's a 1-year shock? And the question is, do you hire new investment banking analysts? Camilo, what do you think about that? You think it's variable? So do you think that when there's a 1-year shock downwards in the demand for like the finance sector, like the finance sector did really badly during 2008 crisis, how much did the companies reduce their hiring? Well, they reduced it somewhat. I think you're right, it's somewhat variable, but they didn't reduce it as much as if there had been a permanent reduction. Why? Because they realize that this is somewhat fixed, that, you know, if you don't hire people this year, you're not going to have as good of a pool of talent for next year, and what if you need your demand for next year? So it's not purely variable. It's somewhere in between, right? You probably want to reduce it by somewhat, but you don't want to reduce it fully. So it's fairly fixed, actually. Because, I mean, think also about universities. When the economy goes bad or there's not as much demand, they keep hiring. They don't hire as much, but they keep hiring because otherwise they're going to be in bad shape in the longer term. So it's actually more fixed than you might think because you have to put so much training into these people. You can't just buy them back and forth so quickly, right? So that's a talented form of labor that is somewhat fixed in the short run. Now, how about a 15-year run for soldiers that you're training to fight in foreign wars? Danielle, what do you think? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. So actually, this is a bit of a storable, because the thing is that, you know, if you only have so many young people in your country and you go fight a lot of wars, the people will be dead and you won't be able to fight more wars, right? So over a very short run, a soldier is actually durable because it takes a while to train a soldier. So if you're thinking about 3 months, if there's a, you know, if there's a war that's only going to last 3 months, you're not going to try to recruit a bunch more soldiers to fight that. You'll just use what you have. But over 15 years, it's actually the other way around. You might be afraid you don't want to fight many wars over that period because the soldiers will either get exhausted or killed in the first war and you won't be able to fight the other war, right? Okay. So another important thing in the analysis is the relative utilization of different factors. And that's affected by the relevant what's fixed and what's variable over the period, right? So more variable factors or more storable factors will adjust to short-run changes and therefore will be used relatively intensely when there is strong demand over a short period for something. Whereas long-run factors will be used relatively more intensely when there's an unexpectedly low demand for something over a period, right? So let's consider some examples. What are the types of short-run versus long-run adjustments to changes for the demand of energy? Sebastian. When there's a short-run versus a long-run change in the demand for energy, what are the types of adjustments that the industry tends to make in order to supply that demand? Yeah. So what sources of energy would adjust if there's a short-run increase in demand? What sources of energy would adjust if there's a long-run increase in demand?
The ones that are more like cost, that have more cost to build like fast, and not like.
Give me an example.
Water, electricity.
Yep. The hydropower.
Yeah, hydropower is more expensive than building the panel, eolic energy.
Yep.
Because it takes more time to, make the research about the river and all.
Yeah, I think that's right, and you can get things that are even more extreme than that. So if there's a short-run increase in demand, you usually get more oil being pumped out of the ground, but that can be done quickly. On the other hand, if there's a long-run increase, we'll put the money into developing shale gas, so we can get gas, and that's what's happened over a very long period of time in the US, or in clean energy technologies. So a short-run increase in demand for energy won't cause any new clean energy technologies to be developed. Those take years of research and all this sort of stuff, right? How about seasonal adjustments in agriculture, Anna? What tends to happen when there's, the seasonal fluctuations in agriculture? How does that change the relative utilization of different things during different seasons? Of things that go into producing agricultural products. What tends to happen during the high seasons in agriculture? Yeah, what are other things they do that are short run? What happens during the flower picking season in Medellin? People migrate into Medellin, right? To pick all the flowers, right? So there's lots of temporary workers who will come in to do the unskilled work, but the land devoted will stay completely fixed, right? So the number of people living in that area, think about, if you want to explain why there's migration, you can do it completely in terms of this analysis. You say land is a fixed factor, labor is a variable factor. So we should expect that during the short run increases in demand, there will be more people living in the place. The ratio of people to land will be higher. When there's relatively low short run things, people to land will. So a lot of these patterns about migration that you see can be explained in terms of what are the fixed and variable factors of production in that area. Right? How about the adjustment to the long run trends in the increase in demand for medicine? Juan? Juan Rojas? No Juan Rojas here. Okay. Well, you know, initially there might be just more doctors, but because it's such a long run trend, there's going to be more schools to train those more doctors, right? And there might be more people going in to being professors of medicine or being trained with PhDs rather than JD. You know, so that's when you have a really long-term secular trend like that, as things go on, initially there's just a lot of more people going to the same medical schools, but eventually there's more medical schools being built and so forth, right? So how about, Roman, what about the cyclical changes in the demand for gold because of, you know, people getting scared about the currency versus the end of the gold standard, which led to a big decrease in the, what would happen in those two cases? Yeah.
So they are going to close it when the demand is going
Yeah.
to go down, and they are going to increase their labor supply when the demand is going to go
Yeah.
down. And in the gold standard, they are going to maintain a stock of labor, I think, but I don't know.
Yeah, well, but they might actually create new mines, right? So, or they could divert the supply from, you know, making jewelry, right? In the short run. Whereas in the long run, they'll actually create new mines or shut down new mines, right? And, or in your case, you said that in the short run, they'll bring in more workers to mine and less workers to mine, whereas building the mines is something that they do only if they expect it to last for a long time. So when we went off the gold standard, the amount of money that was going into finding new mines like plummeted, right? Whereas during the cyclical demand for changes in gold demand just led to changes in how much stuff was coming out of jewelry versus. So like right now when there's been a big demand for gold, lots of people have been melting down their jewelry to sell it back to the gold market, right? But when we went off the gold standard, all the mines shut down. So those are very different reactions that occur depending on whether it's a short or a long run change. Another example of this is the reaction of local governments in the United States versus corporations to the crisis. So when the crisis hit in the United States, local governments realized that, crap, we're not going to have money forever. You know, we're just in deep trouble, right? Because there's all sorts of things about debt hangover and so forth. So they just fired everybody. Whereas corporations said, no, this is a temporary thing, we'll get back. We don't want to lose all these valuable workers we have. So depending on whether they were facing the short run or the long run shock, they made different types of adjustment. Okay. It's not only the expected duration of the shock, but how long the shock has been going on, which matters. So think about it. A short run shock, one that lasts for a short period of time, versus a long run shock have different impacts on the rate at which we start to adjust to things. Because a long run shock is sort of like a short run shock to the rate of adjustment of the thing. So this can lead to lags in the process of returning to the pre-shock equilibrium. So for example, demand for drugs in Mexico dramatically increased when they were able to shut down shipping through Colombia, right? And so there was this big demand for the trade. Now, the crackdown has reduced the profitability of doing that. But the thing is, there were all these people who were trained to be basically criminals, and they've got to do something else with those durable skills they acquired. And so a lot of them turned to other forms of violence, like kidnapping, because there's this lag in untraining all those people. And Colombia had a very similar problem with the paramilitaries, right? The paramilitaries were all training, but now what do they do now that they're being demobilized? And people are trying to retrain them to change their durable skills, but it's obviously a big source of controversy here. Okay. You can also have lags in getting to the post-shock equilibrium. So the greatest relative demand for Google relative to other search engines was 6 years ago, but they've only grown to their giant size in the last couple of years. And the reason is because it took them so long to build up all the people and the physical facilities and all that sort of stuff. Because it was durable, not just the people that they hired or the places they built, but even putting in the infrastructure to build those places was durable. So even the rate at which they started to increase took a while to get going, because they had to hire an HR staff who could hire people who would work there, right? And there can be lags in adjusting away from or towards the cyclical pattern. So for example, California, even though the agricultural techniques have changed there and it's now possible to grow things more year-round there, it has taken a while to adjust away from the standard pattern that people were used to, which is that you migrate in and then you migrate out. It's been a gradual process of switching over to people migrating permanently to stay in California. Okay, so let me give you one kind of cool example of these types of dynamics. So this here is a picture of the number of beef cattle that are alive at any given time. And you see it follows these really steady cycles, which seems really strange. Like, what is going on that's driving all those cycles? Well, think about the following thing. Imagine that demand for cattle increases just randomly one year, right? Well, what do I do in order to supply that demand? I kill some cattle. But if I kill some cattle, that means that there aren't as many cattle to breed, which means that for years afterwards, there will be a reduction in the supply of cattle. Or even worse, imagine that I think that there's a big increase in the demand for cattle right now. I might actually kill less cattle, causing the prices to rise even more this year, so that I have more to breed, so that next year I can kill more cattle, but then that'll ripple through the system for years afterwards. So even just one shock can lead to these persistent cycles for years afterwards. And there's this really nice paper by Jose Shankman, who's my advisor, Kevin Murphy, and Sherwin Rosen, which documents that just from the little fluctuation temporarily in demand, you can get for years afterwards these cycles of cattle production. Okay. Now, uncertainty also plays a really important role in these lags. So, for example, suppose that the demand for the Xbox surges around Christmas time. A natural response of Microsoft is not to build a bunch more factories for making the Xbox. It's to pay a little extra for less, purely devoted factories to make more Xboxes just during that one season. But imagine that now it turns out that that demand wasn't just temporary, that actually it lasted for a long time, that Christmas stimulated this whole new industry of people wanting to buy the Xbox. Then Microsoft will regret not having built extra factories to supply that demand because it lasts longer, and eventually they'll learn, oh, we messed up. It wasn't just a Christmas thing. It was a permanent increase, and eventually they'll build the factories, right? And in fact, notice the fact that demand always surges during Christmas messed Microsoft up in this case, right? They wish that it hadn't been the fact that in the past there had been the cyclical patterns, but then they would have realized that the temporary increase in demand was actually a permanent increase in demand. And this is something that happens all the time. So broader information about the market, not just observing your individual demand, can make a big difference because it can help you figure out how much of this is a temporary increase versus a permanent increase. So Christian Hellwig has a really nice paper on this about macroeconomics. So what he says is that a big problem in macroeconomics is that people have trouble getting access to aggregate market data. Now they're used to looking at how many people come into their store and judging that, but they're used to thinking that if people come into my store extra this week, that's probably just some temporary thing. Whereas if the economy as a whole is doing badly, that might be permanent, and therefore it might be worth adjusting my prices in response to that, right? And so the fact that people don't look at macroeconomic data, combined with the fact that they're used to all these little fluctuations in the demand for their product, means that they don't change their prices enough in response to the demand that they're seeing, and therefore leads to rigidities in the macroeconomy that can cause unemployment. So thus far, I've focused on durable inputs. But now I want to contrast these with an extreme counterexample, which is oil, which is like the most storable, exhaustible commodity. Because oil can be essentially stored in the ground costlessly forever. And imagine that there's no cost of extracting it, which is pretty much true for someone like Saudi Arabia. So the price of oil is going to have to grow at the interest rate over time. Is John Martinez here? No? Why is it going to have to, does anyone want to explain why the price of oil is going to have to grow exponentially at the rate of interest over time? Well, the reason is that imagine that it were to grow slower than the interest rate. Then it would make a lot of sense to sell all your oil today and then to just put it in the bank and let it grow at the interest rate. If it grew faster, you could borrow money that you need today and sell all your oil later and more than pay back. So what that means is that if there's a short-run shock to the price, to the demand for oil, prices for oil, if they're going to go up at all, have to go up at every period in the future. Right? And that means that it's probably not going to be very likely that a short-run increase in the demand for oil will lead to an increase in the price of oil almost at all. Because it would have to increase prices forever from then on, right? And that would affect demand forever from then on. Which means that each year, a temporary increase in the demand for oil won't cause its price to change almost at all. It'll just cause the production to change. So during the summer in the United States, when everyone goes on vacation and uses a lot more oil, the price of oil doesn't change. It's only the quantity produced that changes. So that's like the most extreme example of a storable commodity, right? And so all the things that we were talking about, all these rich dynamics we were discussing, are going to be exactly opposite for oil as what they'll be for these other things. So I hope that so oil is obviously a very extreme example, but it's an important case. But the broader lesson here is that you read all these stories in micro, which are all about the long run versus the short run, but very often they can be exactly opposite if you are thinking about storable things. So for example, in macroeconomics, you learn that the long run supply curve is perfectly vertical, right? That's based on the idea that everything is storable, that you can only intertemporally substitute. There aren't intertemporal complements. But imagine that instead, we had a case where, if the economy isn't producing so much today, people don't go get education. And if they don't go get education, they're not going to be as productive tomorrow. So a short-term change in the, how efficiently the economy is working could lead to a very big long-run change in supply. In that case, the long-run supply curve would actually be more elastic than the short-run supply curve, the opposite of what you hear in macro. On the other hand, in microeconomics, you usually hear that the long-run curves are always more elastic than the short-run curves, which also could be the opposite if it's oil. So you hear these very stylized stories in economics, usually where they tell you this one very extreme case, when in reality it all depends on how durable and storable things are relative to the correct time periods. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you guys is that you can go and write these dynamic models, which are also complicated, but there's a tremendous amount of richness that you can understand about how the world evolves by just thinking through these basic ideas about whether things are intertemporal complements and substitutes and how that interacts with the timing of things. And let's take another 5-minute break before we talk about profits and distribution of rents.